Jon, welcome to Stories in AI. I'm glad we're doing this again.
Yeah, too bad last time we had some technical snafus, but I'm really happy to be back. Really happy to be on your podcast with you, Ganesh. This is I had so much fun last time. I was like, of course I'll do it again.
I know, right? Like we get the chance to do it over. Anyway, yeah. So Jon, thank you. I hope you had a great Thanksgiving. So we were recording this right after the Thanksgiving weekend. Why don't you kick us off with your personal story? You know, how did everything land up, and how did you land up in Data.World and the whole story behind it?
Yeah, I am incredibly lucky to be at Data.World right now. It's a very exciting time to be in the space we're in, to be doing the things that we're doing. I've been very, very blessed and again, lucky to have a great career here in Austin over the last 20 years, working at some incredible software companies, from Trilogy Software to Bazaarvoice to HomeAway.com. I think throughout my career, I've always been very interested in how do we use data to make more informed, more objective, and more insightful business decisions. And particularly at HomeAway, working at a massive consumer, one of the biggest online travel destinations that there were, competing very heavily with Airbnb while I was there, trying to build the company into a more agile and data-driven machine to compete effectively in an incredibly competitive space. We really, at that organization, invested a ton of time and energy, built all the tools, built teams around better data-driven decision-making, built a data science team, invested in a data lake, did all these things. And yet every quarter we found ourselves running the business and making decisions based on these spreadsheets that would get emailed around. And then I had to go explain. I was, again, brilliant job, really fun. I ran traveler-facing engineering at HomeAway VRBO, where, my team would build we would launch features, and I would test these features by looking at HomeAway and browsing castles in France that you could rent. It was awesome. But I had to go explain to this giant engineering team that I had, why our quarterly bonus was going to be built around a certain uptick in conversion. And they would want to know, they'd want to dig into the spreadsheet. We were all math people, and we'd want to dig in and try to figure out, well, why are you saying we should be increasing conversion like that? And these spreadsheets were impossibly dense, impossibly thick, really hard to replicate the results. And I was like, there's got to be a better way. And being a software person, myself and our CTO, who was in an architect role at HomeAway, kind of led the entire architecture team at HomeAway, we were really into knowledge graphs and semantics, and could we do better data management through the use of knowledge graphs? And then I was really interested in how do we bring better collaboration to data analytics projects. That was all very important to us. And so we theorized that there was a missing link between all the giant infrastructure that we were building in data analytics and the people doing the data analytics work, especially as data analytics work and data science became more of a team sport, something that people wanted to work on together, right? Prior to even, we'll say, the last 3 to 5 years, data analytics has been a very individual exercise. And I think a lot of the tooling that we built has been designed around individuals, lone wolves, trying to come up with that one brilliant insight. Hasn't really necessarily spread amongst a group of people. And as more people get involved and have to coordinate that work, it becomes more and more important for us to develop tools and processes and a common language for working together on data analytics projects. And, I'm a big proponent of agile, transparent, and inclusive practices, especially when it comes to data governance and data analytics and AI. And I want to bring our, 30, 40 plus years of software engineering experience to that world. Right. To that end, at Data.World, we're building really exciting tools like our data catalog and our data governance platform to be able to bring that experience to help people work better together, to build these knowledge graphs of their entire data analytics ecosystem so they can discover, use, and reuse data more effectively.
Oh, that's awesome. What a great story, John. And I think, you touched upon many different things, which we will dive into a lot more deeper in the episode. But I think, to your point on the observation that, look, data is moving from, it's not just another functional area that needs to be taken care of by a group of people. Data is a corporate asset, if you will, right? And it can be used to make powerful and contextual decisions for the business, but it has to be done collaboratively. So then the questions around, do the right people have access to the right data and governance? Do you have the latest data, the right quality of the data? All of those things come in. But there's also something that you pointed out in your history when we were talking about the experience at HomeAway, which is storytelling and being able to explain decisions, not just an objective, hey, the graph says so, but explaining the why behind it, the context behind it. All of that kind of brings us to here right now, and it's an amazing time to be in the market for sure. This is a story about this is a show about stories in AI. It's about AI, right? So AI has also really accelerated the whole. I mean, there is a lot of hype around it, of course. There will always one, and anything that is bleeding edge in technology always has the hype cycle that comes with it, which pushes innovation forward, and also does other things. So AI has moved from about even 10 years ago, hey, what is AI? What do I do with AI? To now, how do I scale my AI infrastructure or my efforts around AI? And data comes out as the number one challenge that most of these folks face, right? So give me a lay of the land with what you've seen. What is working? What is not working? What's the state of the market today as you see through your vantage point at Data.World with customers?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest problems that a lot of people have is understanding the data assets they have available to them, discovering them, making them accessible, and then using them in appropriate ways. I think explainability is and reproducibility is a big part that comes out the other end of that. But ultimately, as people think about scaling the data they have available to run AI against, I think it's really important because I think there are a lot of really great tools out there to really quickly ramp AI programs, whether you're talking about HomeAway, Data Robot, these sort of automated AI platforms. Those are great, even all the way down to the open source scikit-learn, things like that, that have been deployed. But if you think about what those tools require, they require well-modeled data. And in a lot of cases, especially the easier to use things, they tend to work well on these very long, skinny, very homogeneous data sets, right? They work well against evented data, time series data, things like that. I think one of the really interesting and very successful applications that you see out there in AI is threat detection, right? But what you're looking at there are these like very homogeneous event logs of everything that's going on across your network, of what's happening at your WAF, things like that. So it's very easy to build those models because you have a well-understood data set. If you look at a traditional enterprise, a bank, an insurance company, an enterprise that some of which have been around for, let's say, 100 years, right? If not like a few dozen years, they've accumulated and amassed much more heterogeneous data that's changed over time, that is sitting in a lot of different stores, that you don't have the kind of meaning associated with it that you would with a, brand new generated, well-modeled, like I said, tall, skinny, streaming data set. And so we need to look for new ways of bringing AI to bear on that sort of data, because there's a really rich vein to be mined there that we haven't been able to mine yet. I think a big way that we mine that, and one of the most important missing links there, is to build a semantic layer on top so that we can apply more advanced AI models that, instead of working on these long, skinny data sets, can work on wider but potentially shallower data sets. And to do that, the machines need to be able to understand the data. The best way for them to do that is to build a semantic graph on top of those data sets that can bring it together and enable more advanced models, things like neural nets and things like that, to operate against that data.
No, it is awesome. So eloquently put. And to your point, right, I think the reality is this, right? We look at the last 5 decades, 6 decades of AI evolution, right? We went from the good old fashioned AI, which was all symbolic logic, kind of semantic beige, you're mapping out relationships within data and stuff, to now 100% data-driven AI or machine learning, which is basically glorified statistics on steroids with better computing, better algorithms, right? And better toolkit, of course. And while that is extremely, extremely valuable, the rich context that resides in this, and we were talking about graphs before we started recording, the rich context that remains in data that is often in multiple dimensions than just a 2x2 Excel spreadsheet kind of form is often lost, because the first thing you do to get into machine learning is flatten the damn data set. Right.
Yep.
So now it's an interesting problem, but you're right.
Well, because you need that data frame to be long and skinny, right? So you flatten it, you denormalize it, and you're like, okay, now you go figure it out.
I agree, and I think I'm fascinated by the evolution of graph neural networks that you can actually start doing computation directly on the graph nodes, and and even the whole notion of a semantic layer on top of data sets to really bring it all together so that you don't lose the context beyond. It's like, it's just a classic BI problem, right? You have the sales guys looking at the same data, making different decisions. The finance guys are looking at the same data differently, making different decisions, but they don't really talk. Those decisions don't have context of each other, right? Mm-hmm. So it's a classic problem. So, go ahead. Sorry.
So I was going to say, let's think about for a second here, the whole idea of like storing the metadata next to the data, making that machine readable and transportable, and making sure that you don't lose that context, right? Because to your point, the people who have that context, it's up here, it's in their head, it's in emails, it's being sent around in Slack messages and things like that. You may stitch something together that gets you a little bit more advanced than the things we were just talking about, just, doing, regression-based machine learning or things like that, right? What's interesting here is, and I love doing this, right? I love applying things that have been successful in software engineering, where we've thought long and hard about how to work together better, how to capture this knowledge, how to bring groups of people and bring their knowledge together. If you think about GitHub, right? And when we started Data.World, we wanted to make GitHub for data. Nobody really knew what that meant. And so now we're in the data catalog space and the governance space. But if you think about GitHub, one of the most powerful things about GitHub is when you first look at a project in GitHub, open source or closed source, however you're using it, it shows you the README. You have a list of the files in the project, and then you have the README, and it's rendered right there, right? And the README is checked in right next to the code. It's not stored separately from the code. It's part of the code. It's just a markdown file that's part of the code. So the context of the README is right next to it. It's actually part of the same repository that the code's part of. It makes sure that, it provides that kind of social pressure to continually update it, because, well, hey, I'm editing the code, might as well update the README at the same time. It gets checked in at the same time as the code, right? It creates that kind of workflow that enables you to capture knowledge in a very simple way and keep it right next to the actual work product. And that proximity effect is incredibly important to making sure that context gets captured. And it seems like an incredibly simple feature, but that feature is incredibly powerful to maintaining that context, right? And we need to think about simple ways in data to maintain that context, to keep that context next to the data, and to tie the things together to build those graphs. And those graphs can be built automatically in the background. But as the data is being maintained, how are we continually enriching the relationships? How are we continually enriching that context in a way that it can be a living, breathing thing? I think so many of these projects end up failing because, and definitely in the governance space, this is very true of the governance space, these things tend to fail because everybody wants to boil the ocean, turns into a top-down, mandated thing. It's not agile. It's not inclusive. You're basically tasking your business people and your data scientists with a chore that they got to do. Go fill out this form in triplicate, do it for all your work that you've done before. No wonder that fails. Nobody likes that. They want to get to the insight. They want to do their work. And if you make these things a chore for folks, it's never going to get done. And if it's done separately from the data and the analysis work itself, if it's not actually, if you don't have that proximity effect, if it's over here in a separate system,
You lose the context.
That system's just going to get tucked in, tucked away, ignored.
Yeah.
Not going to matter.
It's actually, it's fascinating. And I like the analogy that you drew, right? Like the metadata is the ReadMe for data, right? It's a ReadMe for data. And, you touched upon the other thing, which is the often, and I get this question a lot when I talk to customers, clients and stuff. They're like, look, should I go start with getting my data right first before I start AI or ML? Or should I just go start everything together? And I think it's more nuanced and fundamental than an if or or kind of a statement, right? It's like it starts with the whole notion of data literacy and data culture that you actually drive top down, right? How do you make decisions? Who is responsible for what? I mean, how do you actually how do you look for things? How do you share? What are the best practices and stuff? Talk to me a little bit about that collaborative aspect that you were mentioning, right? Around what is the role of data? What is data literacy? And what's the role of that in getting an organization ready to go on a data-driven transformation or journey?
Yeah, God, data literacy is so important all the way. Like, you're right. It has to be a top-down decision. You have to decide that you want a culture to be built around this, much like if you want a technology-driven culture, a product-driven culture that's built around agile, right? Like, there has to be buy-in from the top down to do it, and to do it properly, right? It's not about finding the right chart that goes up and to the right to prove my point, right? It's about going on the journey of exploring the data, of properly having a hypothesis and expressing that hypothesis, of getting the data back and looking at it objectively, having it peer reviewed within your organization. And it's setting up these processes that enable people to work together and communicate better around these sorts of things that I think is really important to building a data-driven culture, starting with that idea of data literacy. I've seen lots of organizations do this in different ways, but I think the fundamental nugget here, the thing right at the core of it, is that people learn best and will build that literacy best by working together, right? Having a data scientist working with a subject matter expert, working with an executive stakeholder in an iterative and agile loop where they're sharing what they need and really building empathy for and knowledge about what everybody's roles are, having those roles well defined and working through it, and then working in a way that you can then share what you've done in a reusable and reproducible way with another group who may want to do the same thing. That will build data literacy, I think, faster than anything else you do. I think you have to augment that, though. Augment that with educational programs, with cultural programs. I also think that this is a really great place, honestly. And this is going to sound a little like out of left field here. It's also a really great place to work on diversity and inclusion in your business, because there's almost no better way to teach people about bias than when they're working with data, right? To teach people about the different forms of bias. And that's another great way to increase data literacy and increase inclusion and diversity, really teach people what that really means, right? One of my favorite books is a book called Weapons of Math Destruction that Kathy O'Neill really looks at that. Yeah. But I think, it's to work on a data literacy program is also a very safe place to work on diversity and inclusion, because you can work on learning about bias in a very safe, non-controversial way, right? And really get people thinking about that.
I love that. I love that idea. I think we should, definitely, I want to explore that further with you at some other time, maybe a future episode even.
Absolutely.
But gosh, the data literacy concept itself, it's so huge. It's so nuanced and it's so broad than just, hey, I need to make sure everybody knows about what the data is and what the policies are, right? It's a cultural tenet, right? It's something that you have to approach it just like you would approach diversity and inclusion, for example, right?
Yep.
It's fascinating. I think I one of the things that we've been like, the notion of data literacy collaboration also gave rise to this rise of data sharing and marketplaces, data marketplaces, catalogs and stuff all kind of come around. Is it really just a vision, all of this, or is it is it a reality in some form or fashion, and what's the pathway it's taking us towards?
No, I think data marketplaces, especially internal data marketplace. I think there's a lot we have to work out to really build, and I think it's one of the holy grails of the entire tech industry to have a global public data marketplace.
Of course, yeah.
Right? I think there's a lot of folks out there that would love to do things like that. But I think the idea of internal marketplaces and the idea of creating data, consumable, operational data products that are built around domains and shareable throughout an enterprise, I think that's where you're really seeing a lot of hay being made in the idea of data marketplaces. If you can treat your data assets, let the domain owners and the people within individual groups really work on modeling them well, making them consumable and usable, measure them like products, but then create a marketplace of those ideas across an entire enterprise. I think that's a place where, we're seeing some real progress being made, both in terms of the thought model, when you think about data mesh, right? If you've followed any of Jamak's stuff on data mesh, the domain-driven data modeling and treating data as a product being the two primary tenets there. And if you think about that as an organizing function, and then you think about having to apply discovery access on top of that, that's really where internal data marketplaces, I think, can get a lot of traction once people start adopting that kind of data-driven, product-oriented approach to creating data products that can be used by a broader swath of your organization or enterprise.
Got it. And it's fascinating how this evolution is, right? So Holy Grail, definitely data marketplaces, global marketplaces, but these elements of there's all these building blocks that are being built within organizations, like data catalog being one of them. You mentioned data mesh, and I'll come to that in just a minute, but the whole governance processes, all of those building blocks are in place. And then truly, like Snowflake wants everybody to just, hey, data sharing. Here's a data sharing environment, share your data and monetize it, right? Holy Grail, definitely. And I think, if everybody is on a cloud-based data warehouse like Snowflake, and you're all in the right, they can take care of all the rights and authorization and sovereignty of data and stuff, well, then it becomes an easier problem to go solve if you want to just open up for monetizing data, right? But data mesh, you mentioned data mesh, and I'm also following that space very well with the whole notion of data being product, treat data as a product, and how do you create self-sustained business units or like units to actually take care of the data? Is that going to be more of a mess as data mesh as we go into the future? Because one concern I have, like I'll give you a parallel from back in the day, cloud days, right? We started talking about self-service, right? And, I have this personal experience. I was running an engineering team. I was working at Dell. I was running an engineering team in India and Taiwan. And we were introduced for the first time with, I think, VMware's vCloud Director or whatever. Like there was a self-service tool that was initially launched, Lab Director, something like that. And we like, oh, let's try this out. And we had this whole swath of infrastructure. And we gave access to all the engineers and say, build your own VMs and start, doing it, using it for your testing. The next Monday morning, that happened on a weekend. Monday morning, there's red banks on all of the single hosts because the infrastructure is all used up. Because there was early days, right? So the whole notion that self-service worked, but, you have to have the controls and things in place to reduce sprawl in that case, right? So are we there at that level of maturity with data? Because we're still trying to figure out, where are my pockets of data? How do I discover it? How do I understand it, right? Mm-hmm. So now you're talking about, okay, giving access to people and business units to become pods, to go start working on whatever they want to do with data. And we can connect it, semantically or otherwise, across the globe and make it useful. So tell me a little bit about maybe start off with, maybe I'm even misinformed on what a data mesh is, right? So
I think you've got a lot of the basic idea. And I think that there is that double-edged sword. Everybody's got their story of like waking up one morning, discovering that, a new engineer has racked up a $10,000 AWS bill out of nowhere, right? Or like a 10x AWS bill. Those things happen. And I think, there is a danger of that in data mesh. I think another, analogy we draw on with data mesh is the idea of microservices. Right. And I've known tons of engineering organizations that have gone on a microservices journey of taking it to the extreme and end up with these like service call chains that are so long that you can't, get your transactions per second up because like you're ganging up all these service calls that can't be performant. Or, you end up with service sprawl and you don't know how to manage all the different resources that are going into hosting those services. So I think there is need in a data mesh to define what your domains are, to make sure that they're well defined, and to set up the rules of the road well around what those interface points are going to be. And I think that there's still very much a role for a centralized architecture best practices group, but it's more about like setting up that center of excellence and making sure that people are well educated around kind of the do's and don'ts, the rules of the road, and what your global architecture is going to be for how these domains are going to interact. I think if you do that, you can get to a very good point with something like a data mesh. Now, I think the inverse of this is also true. I really agree with you around self-serve and data analytics. I think that there's a lot of broken promises out there. We were told that if we stood up these cloud data warehouses and gave everybody Tableau, and self-serve would happen and all your DBAs would be happy. They wouldn't have to deal with all these ad hoc requests anymore. One of the biggest reasons that we started Data.World was when I was at HomeAway, we had a Tableau server instance that had like 600-700 different dashboards in there. I didn't know what to go look at. I had to like keep a little cheat sheet on my desktop, right, of the right dashboards to look at, track our goals. And I was like, there's got to be a better way. And so I think as we think about, a data mesh, I think one of the interesting things about a data mesh is, yes, you could end up with sprawl. But I think the idea of a data mesh too is that you want to have these well-defined interface points and these well-defined data domains so that everybody knows what is actually available. And if we do that, and we do that well with the right level of governance, and it's always a matter of like all things in life, it's striking the right balance, finding the right moderation, and finding the right level of standardization that actually enables, through a data mesh, better discovery and reuse. Because what you're really aiming for, and as you set up a program around this, you should also be measuring it, is are these data products getting used? Are they worth having around? When they're not getting used, what are we going to do to cull those products so they're not sitting there confusing everybody? And if you can monitor it, audit it, and govern it the right way, right? Govern it from a standpoint of observing what's happening and measuring what's happening, not, sign these 3 forms in triplicate controlling what's happening, right? Then I think you can, prune and improve and let these evolutions happen, but do so in a way and create like the right tooling and infrastructure to enable the discovery and the semantic linking of things without having the sprawl. But you got to be careful. Learning from the past is incredibly important. Right? We gotta take the microservices, the cloud, all of that. We have to learn from the things that have come before us. And I think when we do that, we can make a lot of progress a lot faster than trying to reinvent the wheel.
No, I agree. I think, on the one side, when you started, explaining this, you mentioned like we stood up this centralized monolithic infrastructures for like data catalogs, your centralized data warehouse, to serve up all these things, and self-service dashboards, and with all kinds of tools to request and build your own dashboards and so forth. It didn't really solve the problem. The one aspect of that, I would say that slightly, I think it's kind of is very similar to what you're saying, which is, the centralized team often weren't the experts at how that data is going to be used for what decisions, right?
It's true.
And data mesh theoretically is supposed to solve that, because you're now data products that are being maintained by all these pods or units that have very unique understanding of the business problem, the needs of the business, and how to interpret the data for their needs, right?
Yeah, and I think one of the key bits here is if you're going to treat it as a product, you got to measure it like it's a product, right? Are people getting the value out of the thing you're producing that you think they're getting? Is it being used for a broader array of things than you thought? Or is it not getting used at all? You have to be really objective about that. And you have to manage it as if it's a product and an asset to be leveraged. If you have an asset that's not getting leveraged, what should you do with it? Well, you should prune it, or you should figure out how to improve it and iterate on it.
Yeah. I have, a couple more questions, and I'm keeping an eye on the time right now. One is, So there is like the data scientist or machine learning engineer jobs have been super hot for the last few years, at least 3-4 years, right? And rightly so, because everybody's trying to figure it out. Well, my experience when I was building Molecular, working on the data engineering side and stuff, is that the average Fortune 500 company will require the order of 3 to 4 data engineers to support every data scientist, right? And even though the maturity of the tooling and infrastructure and capabilities like the data catalogs, like a semantic layer, all are coming into play, it still is a huge, I believe there's a bigger hole in the market that to get more data engineers than just data scientists, right? Are we going to start seeing, and this is more a hypothetical question even, right? Are we going to see that the analytic engineer or the data engineer who's also understanding analytics from the bottoms up, from a data bottom being decisions on that of this thing, is going to replace the data scientist role in the long run?
I think they're going to continue to be highly complementary. And, what I'm really excited about for the data engineering space and the data modeling space, and all things are cyclical, and you're even seeing people get excited about like old ideas like Kimball-Ross modeling and star schemas and things like that again, right? Like, because there are a lot of good ideas in a lot of that old data warehousing literature around how to make data more useful. But it was always really hard because you had to wrangle the infrastructure first.
Yep.
Now that infrastructure is so much easier to wrangle, it's really going to enable your analytic engineers, your data engineers to level up.
Yep.
Right. Start really thinking about their data as a product and start thinking about, instead of the ad hoc request for some new data coming in and being like, oh my God, it's such a pain. Now, a data engineer is here thinking about, oh, I got this new request. And you know what? I've seen 3 or 4 of that same request. How do I update my models to be able to satisfy that in a way that's reusable so that a broader part of my organization can get some real use out of that? And that will become the more interesting challenge for them, is building useful data products rather than how do I just like make this data warehouse function. Now, will that require more or less? Will that reduce the value of the data scientist and increase the value of the data engineer? I actually think it increases the value of all these roles together. Because, again, history repeating itself. You could say that, hey, like you've reduced the value because we can write software in Python now. Like it reduces the value of the software engineer because nobody has to learn assembly anymore. Right? Well, no, the opposite is true. And in fact, I think like even if you look at in software engineering, offshore, nearshore, like local software engineers, the value of the software engineer has actually gone up as we've introduced more and more useful abstractions, because it enables the software engineer to get closer to the business to really understand the problems rather than just focus on the pure technical aspect of what they're doing. And I think you're going to see the same thing in both data engineering and data science. I think these roles are going to continue to be complementary. Maybe you'll end up back in a more of a one-to-one spot, right, between the data scientist and the data engineer. But I think they are very complementary roles. And I think as the abstractions get better and better, the value of both increase, as long as those people are thinking about the future and thinking about, wow, like if they look at these things, whether it's like the data warehouses getting really good or low code, no code environments or automated machine learning environments, the better this stuff gets. The more it enables these people to work closer with the business. And if you look at that as being a desirable outcome, then their value will increase. If people get defensive about that, then we'll figure out how to abstract it away, outsource it, whatever.
It is right? Like anything else. No, it's a that's also turns out to be a really good, fascinating piece of advice, which is like embrace the system level thinking, embrace up level yourself to get closer to the business. And just like history has shown, that's going to make your roles a lot more valuable in the future. So no, that was great. I have one last question for you.
Sure. Yeah.
What are your 2022 data predictions?
Ooh. Man, this market and the entire ecosystem has been so hot. you're really seeing an explosion in the modern data stack and a specialization of tools across the different layers of the stack. Everything from data catalogs, data discovery, to data quality, lineage, automated AI and ML tools. And you see this sort of specialization. I think a lot of folks don't know what to do with that. It's hard to tell if people are going to want one-stop shops or going to want best of breed, or is it going to be something in between those two things? Mm-hmm. But I think 2022 is going to bring a lot of thinking in that way, and we'll see the world kind of go one way or another in that. And so, it will be interesting to see how that plays out as the stack continues to splinter and as you see tool specialization. Will people embrace that, or will people rebel against that?
Yep. No, that's a good question. Awesome. No, Jon, this was awesome. What are your final? Give me a quick 30-second word of advice for organizations in their data journey today.
Oh, man, don't forget the people-oriented aspect of it. I loved the part of our conversation when we were talking about data literacy. You got to bring people along for the ride here. You got to respect the jobs that they're doing. And I think the more that we focus on people working together in efficient ways that respects collaboration and inclusivity and transparency, right? If we think about the people, then the process, and then select the tools that are going to support the kind of culture that you want to build, rather than starting the opposite way. And so if you pick a cool tool and you're like, oh my God, I gotta change this or that or the other thing, like that's almost a recipe for success. Think about the culture you want to build first. Then think about the processes that are going to support that culture and the people doing that work. Do you want to bring people together, or do you want to split them apart? And then as you discover what that means to you, then pick the tools that you want to use. I think that's my bit of advice as people go on this journey is always remember the people have to do the work, right? And the people hold the knowledge. So I think it's one of those paradoxes of our industry that they're like, well, data will just solve everything. We'll let the machines make the decisions. And if we let the machines do all the work, then we just have to we just back off of this, right?
Yeah.
One of my favorite authors right now is Ben Stansel. If you check out BENN at .substack.com, he's one of the founders of Mode Analytics. A couple of weeks ago, he wrote a piece called "Does Data Make Us Cowards?" Right, and it's all about let's just if we get the one more piece of data, we'll make the decision easier or not. But as leaders, we got to make those decisions. I think one of the key decisions we have to make is what kind of data-driven culture do we want to build, and then work down from that, rather than try to just solve it with another magic bullet, solve it with another tool.
That's awesome. If you know Ben, we need to actually invite him to the show. And
I don't. I would love to meet him too, honestly.
Okay.
My God,
try reaching out to him. I'll see how he responds. I'll let you know. Hey, Jon, This was fascinating. Great conversation about data culture, literacy, meshes, the graph, and the whole 9 yards. How can the viewers and listeners get in touch with you? Where can they find you on the internet?
I am super obvious and super transparent. I am Jon Loyens everywhere, Twitter, LinkedIn, everything. Search for my first name, last name. You'll find me. I'd love to hear from everybody about this stuff.
That is awesome. Jon, go on Twitter. I just tweeted out a picture of us saying we were doing this recording. Follow me, Follow Stories in AI, and retweet that. Get the word out. Thank you so much for getting on the show. This was awesome. I'll let you know what the logistics of launching it.
Awesome. Thank you, Ganesh, and have a great morning. All right.
All right. You too.